I stood on my daughter's front step, with my hand hovering over the worn brass knocker, already tasting the argument in the back of my throat. The paint around the doorbell was chipped from years of sun, a small failure I'd meant to fix last fall and never did. Through the wood came her voice, thin and trembling with a rage I didn't know she had. "Go away, or I'll call the police!" When she'd checked the peephole a moment earlier, her eyes had been mirrors, cold, without the old half-smile that used to bloom every time she said Dad. I felt something quiet come over me then, like the precise stillness right before concrete sets. I nodded, not to her because the door was shut and her fear had shut it more tightly than any lock, but to the truth of the moment. I turned, stepped off the porch, walked to my car and drove home, my knuckles loosening on the wheel as if releasing the last of the old illusions. In the hallway, I didn't take off my coat. I set my keys in the wooden bowl she'd turned in 7th grade woodshop. The lips sounded uneven because she'd been impatient, and I took out my phone and called a realtor. If they were determined to lose the house, then I would make the loss count in the only way that still protected what I'd built. The first proof had arrived by accident, though in truth most disasters announced themselves in small, bureaucratic ways. A misdialed number from a board clerk, a letter addressed to the wrong party, a statement slipped under the wrong door. The bank had called my landline and left a clipped message about a delinquency notice for Hannah's address. I called back thinking there'd been a mistake, and the mistake obliged me with a stack of documents that printed out of my tired inkjet like confessions, credit lines opened in neon midnights, a home equity line tethered to the house I co-signed for, applications we had never discussed, because discussion would have broken the spell. I drove to Lucas's office with the papers in a folder and a feeling in my stomach like wet rope. In the break room, he was laughing at something a co-worker said, and the expensive watch he loved caught the fluorescent light with a smug little wink. I waited for the co-worker to leave. Then I laid the report between us. Coffee sloshed over the lip of his mug and ran toward the edges of my proof. "Where did you get these?" he asked, and his voice cracked on the first word, the way boys' voices do when their bodies are catching up to their decisions. "The bank called me," I said. "They thought I was you, or they thought you were me, or they forgot the difference. $53,000, gambling debts, secured against my daughter's home." He stepped closer, and I could smell cologne undercut by nervous sweat. The lights buzzed like angry wasps. "This doesn't concern you, old man." The phrase might have worked on a different father, or on me 10 years earlier, when I still believed we were all playing on the same team. "It concerns me," I said, laying out each sheet, "because I put 30 years of overtime into the equity you're turning into chips. You tapped a second mortgage, a line of credit. You even poked holes in her retirement. It's all here." He swept the papers aside and they fell in a whispering drift, and for a second I saw him as a boy, who learned early to knock pieces off the board when he was losing. I bent and gathered the pages with the same methodical care I used to sort rebar schedules from concrete pour tickets. "She knows," he said to my shoulder, but a small tremor in his voice clipped the word into 2 pieces. "Does she?" I asked. I showed him the screenshot of the latest application, 30,000 more against the same house. He snatched for my phone and missed, and the fear that flashed across his face was neither theatrical nor adult. It was the old panic of a child who has lost the trick. "You don't understand. I had a system. Your system is about to cost her the roof over her head. She's my wife," he said, as if that rearranged the math. "Has been for 3 years. And I'm the co-signer who poured a lifetime into those walls," I said, and the room suddenly felt too small for our stories to stand in together. He set the mug down hard enough to crack the handle, and coffee began to creep over the laminate toward my papers like a stain that knew its job. "Stay out of it." I folded the damp sheets into my jacket and walked out, my footsteps measuring the long hallway like a checklist. It was 3:30 when I pulled into Hannah's driveway, and I counted backward from her shift end to Lucas's after hours until I found a window for truth. The SUV sat in the afternoon light, like something borrowed from a glossier neighborhood, and my old truck looked like a confession beside it. I knew the house the way you know a body you have cared for, where it ached in winter, where the back door swelled in August, where the joists sang when a heavy box was dragged across the attic. I had built the raised bed in the yard with my knees bent under the old sun, and replaced the water. Heater 2 winters ago when the element died on a Sunday. And the only store open was run by a man who'd once been my apprentice. Hannah opened the door before I could knock. "Mom, let me call you back. Dad's here," she said into the phone, then hung up and gave me a careful smile that didn't arrive all the way to her eyes. "This is unexpected. We need to talk," I said, and the old words felt small in my mouth. She gestured toward the living room, and I noticed the sanctioned sprawl of Lucas's gaming setup, devouring a corner, and the way the expensive candle scent had to fight a stale undertone of worry. "Coffee?" she asked. "The way you offer a ritual when you don't want the god to notice what you're hiding." "This is serious," I said. "It's always serious with you," she answered lightly, though her hands were already moving toward the grinder, and I saw the little tremor she tried to outrun. On the counter behind the toaster, a stack of bills was tucked as if the metal could hide paper. The refrigerator was a shrine to their wedding, and I was a smudge at one edge, a necessary blot left over from a drafting process. "I found out about the gambling debts," I said. The scoop clattered, a small metallic gasp. "What gambling debts?" "These," I said, and I spread the documents. 53,000, maybe more. Lines of credit. A second mortgage. The house is collateral. The color left her face and then returned as a flush, and I watched the old child's defense rise, the one that says, "If I don't look, it isn't there." "No," she said. "Lucas would never, our house, no." "It's here," I said gently, though there's no gentle way to say the truth once it's time. 30,000 on a second, 15 on a line. Transfers to gambling sites at 2:14 a.m., 3:07. 3:52. Offshore rails you can rent by the hour. "Stop," she said, and she swept the papers so they fluttered to the tile. And for a breath I saw her as a little girl pushing a report card under the couch cushion before I got home. I bent to gather the pages again, and my knees let me know I was 58, and concrete had taken its due from my joints. "Why would I make this up?" I asked, but we were past questions that could be answered by reason. "Because you never liked him," she said, the pitch of her voice climbing the way panic climbs a ladder. "Because you want to break us." "I want to save your roof," I said. "We've never missed a payment," she said, and I heard the truth behind it, that she kept the one number she could stand to look at. "Because you don't know about the other payments," I said, and I held up a page until she pressed her hands hard over her ears like a child pushing the ocean away. "He loves me," she said. "He would never hurt me." Her hand was already reaching for her phone, and she got it, and she lifted it not to call for help, but to ward off the shape of the truth in the room. "Get out," she said. "Get out or I'll call the police. I have been hurt in my life by things I did not see coming, by accidents, by layoffs, by the long hand of chance. This wasn't hurt. This was the clarity that arrives when the last prop is kicked away, and you see the line of the foundation, cracked where you never thought to look." I folded the papers one last time, neat, as if order could still do its small work. "You'll call the police on your father," I said quietly, and I watched a flicker cross her face, the flicker of a story she once believed about who we were to one another. "You worked 18-hour days so I could live without debt," she said, and her voice was suddenly very small, as if she were remembering aloud before scolding herself for it. Then she shook her head hard, and the adult returned and held the phone higher. "You're not saving anything," she said. "You're trying to ruin my marriage." I paused in the doorway. "I hope Lucas is worth it," I said. "He is. I hope the house is too." Outside the curtains swallowed her. She was there watching, the way children watch when they want their parent to turn around and beg them to change their mind, and I did not beg. On the drive home I rehearsed my next conversation, the one with a man who understood the legal weight of signatures and the geometry of ownership. I did not sleep. At 2 in the morning, I replayed every decision that had seemed small at the time and now felt like a hinge. The day we co-signed. The way I let Lucas use words like investment, like talismans that I didn't challenge because I didn't want to turn my daughter's dinner table into a courtroom. At 3, I remembered the meeting at the kitchen table when Evelyn drew 2 columns on a sheet of lined paper and titled them Rent and Mortgage, and then wrote in her clean, teacher's hand the numbers that would become our discipline. At 4, I made coffee as black as those years when cream was a luxury, and the mortgage company's letterhead controlled our Saturdays. By 7, I was in Donald Kessler's office, which had heavy furniture and good lighting, and the quiet hum you hear in rooms where work gets done without show. He scanned the file like a surgeon studying a case he already knew the outcome of. "Partition isn't common in a family context," he said, "but you're a co-applicant on the original mortgage. That makes you a co-owner. They encumbered the property without your consent. That's a breach." He explained the process, and it lay itself out in my mind like a blueprint: complaint, service, discovery, deposition, hearing, order. He would ask the court to force a sale, divide the proceeds by ownership, and award fees. I told him to move forward, and when I walked out into the parking lot, the sun had climbed to a height that made everything look cleaner than it was. Lucas arrived at my door that evening with a face flushed by anger and the sheen of alcohol he thought he'd disguised. He pounded 3 times, paused, pounded 3 again, as if he believed cadence could make him the law. I opened with the chain still on and said his name the way you say a word you want to learn to live without. He told me Hannah had described my little stunt and my fake documents. I asked him if she mentioned the number 53,000, and he said they were investments, and that online poker was just a gateway to real estate plays and crypto rails, and that I didn't know how modern money moved. He was right about that last part. What he didn't know is that the laws governing property are older than any spin of the newest coin. I asked if I should call Hannah so he could tell us both the story about how gambling sites now offered condos in Miami, and his anger broke into a smile that had no warmth in it. He leaned closer and told me that old lonely men sometimes had accidents, and I watched the threat sit there between us, like a badly laid brick. "Are you threatening me?" I asked. "I'm explaining reality," he said, and then he walked away toward a BMW he could not afford. He thought he'd put fear in my chest, but all he'd done was finish my proof that conversation was over, and only the careful instruments of the law could accomplish anything now. The letter from his attorney arrived a week later, full of bluster and the usual threats about slander and emotional distress, a paper tiger that Donald read and set aside with the small smile of a man who has catalogued every trick. He drafted a notice of deposition, and when the day came, I sat across from Lucas in a sterile conference room with an old pot of coffee steaming tiredly in a corner. His lawyer objected in a nervous rhythm that seemed to comfort only himself. I told the story in dates and amounts, not because I wanted to relive them, but because numbers are the skeleton of the truth. The overtime hours, the early mortgage payments, the HELOC draw on a Wednesday at 3:07 a.m., and the second mortgage filed the following week, the application 28 days later for another line of credit. Lucas contradicted himself twice in 5 minutes, and then admitted he had borrowed a little for online ventures, and by the time we rose and shook hands with nobody meaning it, I knew the line we had been walking had ended. The hearing was brief. The judge asked clear questions and listened while Donald led her through the file. On the other side of the aisle, Hannah stared at the table as if the wood were about to offer an escape hatch. Lucas worried his tie and pretended to be stoic for her sake, which might have been the only truly human thing he did in that room. The ruling came with the clean sound of a gavel that has hit 1,000 conclusions. My rights as co-applicant affirmed, their breach recorded, a partition by sale ordered, fees awarded. The relief I felt wasn't triumph. It was the relief of someone who hears a building stop groaning and knows that at least it won't fall on anyone else today. The court-ordered sale was a quiet, strange day. Strangers walked through rooms I could navigate with my eyes closed. A young couple stood in the backyard and measured sunlight with their hands and asked if the soil was good for tomatoes, and I told them it was rich where the old compost pile used to sit, and that the hose bib on the south side dripped if you didn't turn it tight. And they smiled the unburdened smile of people at the beginning of a long, lucky stretch. Hannah kept her distance. When it was over and I was walking to my truck, she called my name and I turned and waited because there are certain things you never teach a daughter by not turning. "Why?" she asked, and the word collapsed into the air like a tent without a center pole. I told her I had given facts and time and the chance to look together, and that she had answered with the police, and that there are thresholds a person cannot cross without becoming someone else, in a way that is not easily reversible. "It was my home," she said, and she wasn't looking at the house. She was looking at all the Sundays and the dinners, and the lamp-lit conversations that house had held for her idea of a life. "It was a house," I said softly, Not to diminish the love that had lived there, but to name the timber and drywall that had been asked to carry more than it could. Homes need foundations that don't shuffle under pressure. You chose a man who built with cards. She said she was sorry, and I said I was too. And we stood for a moment in a shared field of regret that neither of us knew how to cross. And then I walked away. Not because I wanted to end the scene dramatically, but because sometimes the most loving thing a person can do is accept the outcome they worked to prevent. A year went by in the ordinary way. Days stacked, small tasks done, the body doing its familiar labor. My share of the equity sat in a separate account I rarely touched, because touching it felt like handling a memorial. I trimmed the citrus, replaced a section of fence, fixed the kitchen drawer that had been sticking for 6 months, and each repair was a small sermon about how attention is love, in its least poetic and most useful form. The bowl by my door still held my keys, and sometimes when I set them down at night, I would rub the uneven lip with my thumb until I felt the exact spot where the sandpaper had slipped in her small hand. I drank my coffee black in the morning, the way I had during those years when everything extra went to principle, and sometimes after dinner I sat on the porch and let the light fade and thought of Evelyn and the way she would have held my arm when we walked, and how we would have argued, politely over whether I had been too hard or not hard enough. There are arguments you're allowed to lose only with the dead. News of Lucas filtered in the way all news from other lives does, through mutual acquaintances and the impersonal intimacy of social media. He had left the sales job. There had been a rumor of a suspension over lack of transparency that might have been worse than it sounded. He tried a startup with a friend and posted animated graphs that went up and to the right until they stopped being posted at all. I heard from a man who knew a man at a bank that another line of credit had been closed and a car had been repossessed at dawn, the old hour of humiliations. Of Hannah I heard less, which is the part that gnawed at me. A photo of her in a small apartment with a plant on the sill and a smile that seemed borrowed. A caption about fresh starts that looked like it had been polished to keep the trolls at bay. I didn't like the idea of trolls in the same sentence as my daughter, but this was the world. And I had chosen to stand in the section of it where fathers do not fix things by showing up with a wrench when they are not invited. One evening in late spring, I was cleaning out the garage, the honest tiredness of the work replacing the useless kind, when I found the box labeled house mortgage stuff in my own handwriting, the angled capital H, a relic from a drafting class. Inside were the old stubs and letters, the congratulations from the bank when we paid the loan off early, as if we had done them a favor. The amortization schedule with my pencil marks, showing where each extra 50 shaved a day or two off the future. I sat on an overturned bucket and let the paper weight my hands. I could still hear 7-year-old Hannah asking why I always wrote 50 more than the number the bank asked for, and I could still see the serious way she'd nodded when I told her that interest was rent you pay on money and that I wanted to fire the landlord early. I had believed then that teaching her the math of ownership would also teach her the faithfulness that makes ownership valuable. Faithfulness is harder to pass along than arithmetic. A week later, a knock came at my door that did not pretend to authority. 2 soft raps, a pause, then one more like a question. When I opened it, Hannah stood there in a plain dress with a cardigan that had pilled at the elbows, and she looked smaller in a way that had nothing to do with size. We stared at each other for the beat that contains every possible script, and then she stepped into my arms, the way she used to after nightmares about fires and dogs that could talk, and ran away. She cried into my shirt, and I felt the old father body do the thing it knows best, which is to become a structure for someone else's weight. We moved to the kitchen table, and she wrapped both hands around a mug of tea she didn't drink. "He's gone," she said quietly. "Not legally, he's still wherever he is, but he's gone from me." She laid out her year the way a person describes a storm after it's passed. Matter of fact, with occasional tremors. There had been a job she liked and then didn't, a set of friends who divided silently along the old fault lines of marriage and blood, an apartment she could afford if she stayed careful. She had paid off 3 small debts and was chipping at a larger one, and the plant in the window was not an Instagram prop but a living thing she wanted to keep alive. She told me she sometimes woke in the night with the urge to tiptoe down a hall she no longer had, to check a door she no longer owned. She told me she had almost called me 100 times, and then imagined my voice and hung up, and I told her that the voice in her head is untrustworthy when the heart is ashamed. I chose him, she said. I chose a story about what life should feel like, and then married the man who could pitch it. I said that all of us, at one time or another, sign contracts with desire and forget to read the clauses about cost. We sat until the streetlight came on over the sidewalk, like a reminder that life brims with small, reliable mercies, and she asked if I would come see her apartment, and I said yes, because yes is the only answer a father can give to a daughter who finally wants to show him where she lives. Her place was on the second floor of a quiet building that had been a rougher address when I was 30, and now held students, nurses on odd shifts, young teachers with bulletin boards in their cars, a widower who walked a beagle that believed in everyone. She showed me a bookshelf she'd built from cinder blocks and pine, the plant that was indeed alive. A framed photo of Evelyn at the beach the year we could finally afford to go. On the counter, a glass jar labeled House had a silent joke in it that made both our faces pull into something like a smile. "It's not for a down payment," she said quickly, as if I might lecture. "It's for when the faucet leaks or the stove sputters. When you own something, you take care of it." I felt the sentence land in the kitchen like a small, firm miracle. I didn't tell her that the miracle was not that she remembered my words. It was that she had chosen to live by them, now that they hurt a little less. We did not become a commercial for reconciliation. She did not move back into some old version of my approval, and I did not turn into a saint. There were days when she didn't call, and I had to learn not to fill the silence with frightened stories. There were mornings when I woke angry at Lucas all over again, and had to go outside and cut back the bougainvillea until it stopped trying to own the fence. But there were also the small forward motions that tell you a structure is sound. A Saturday spent assembling a wobbly thrift store table into something that would hold. An afternoon mixing soil on her balcony, while the beagle sniffed our elbows. A text with a photo of a bill paid, and a string of emojis that took the place of old sticker charts. I learned that at the clinic where she worked, she was gentle with people who were afraid of pain, in a way that made me want to sit in the waiting room for no reason and listen to strangers say her name gratefully. She learned that my stubbornness could be a kind of tenderness turned inside out, and that I would drive across town at 10 at night to adjust the strike plate on a door that had begun to catch. Once, months later, I saw Lucas downtown by accident. He was leaning against a wall smoking a cigarette, a habit he had adopted to look like the boys in movies who gamble and win. He saw me and made a face that was supposed to be a smirk, but came out like a wince, and I considered walking over. Not to gloat, and not to deliver the moral he had earned, but to tell him the truth he might yet live by, that systems built on the thrill of almost winning will eventually ask you to sign over parts of yourself you didn't know were negotiable, that the only high that lasts is the one you get from doing the same boring, faithful thing 1,000 times, until a life appears that can bear your weight. I didn't cross the street. There are sermons that only time can preach, and I am not its understudy. When I got home that evening, I stood a long time in my small garden, the hose ticking in my hand, the air cooling into the kind of forgiving temperature that makes you want to reset your life. The citrus trees were heavy and needed thinning. I pruned the branches the way I was taught, at an angle just above a bud that faced the direction I wanted the new growth to go. The cut must be clean. The next branch will follow the line you make. Inside, on my desk, lay the bowl with the uneven lip, and beside it, a thick envelope I'd written Hannah's name on. Here it contained the deed to my house, the one I had paid off in 1,000 small obediences, and a letter explaining, in the plain language I've always used to talk about money and love, that the house would be hers when I was done with it. That you don't throw a house at a person like a gift you hope will snap them into gratitude. That you leave it to them like a foundation you believe they will understand how to stand on. I sealed the envelope and put it in the safe, not because I expected to die soon, but because there is a peace that comes from arranging your affairs in a way that tells your child the story you would want them to remember when they are too tired to remember anything else. I slept well that night. Before dawn I woke for no reason and lay in the dark listening to the old house creak the way it always has, each sound a reassurance that the frame still knows how to carry its loads. When the first thin light slid between the blinds, I got up and made coffee. I drank it at the kitchen table with the window cracked so the morning could come in. And I thought of the phrase I had said to the judge and to my daughter and, finally, to myself. A house is wood and plan and cost. A home is the willingness to maintain what you say you love. Under my breath, I added a line I had learned the hard way and would carry forward now that I had earned it. Foundations are built twice, once with money and once with mercy, and both need maintenance or they fail. I washed the cup, set it upside down to dry, and went outside to check the new growth for the direction it had chosen, ready to cut again if it needed help finding the light.